The glossy pamphlet was tucked just under his brass paperweight, right next to a printed real estate listing with my address at the top. The bold font proudly announced my home of 40 years was hitting the market for $1.2 million. I just stood there in my son's home office, tracing the rim of my reading glasses, feeling the chill of the air conditioning settle deep into my bones. The pamphlet was for a facility named Whispering Pines. The cover promised assisted living for those who can no longer assist themselves. But the real estate printout was what truly broke my heart. It noted that the property would be vacant and ready for immediate possession by the end of the month. That was only 3 weeks away. I didn't yell, and I didn't confront him when he walked into the room a moment later to ask if I wanted a cup of tea. I just smiled, folded the pamphlet into my cardigan pocket, and told him I was feeling a bit tired. David had always been a man in a hurry, convinced the world couldn't spin without him pushing it forward. After his father passed, he insisted on taking over my finances, claiming it was too much of a burden for a 72-year-old widow to manage alone. I let him take the reins. It seemed easier than arguing, and in my grief, I thought it was a genuine act of love. But over the last few months, his visits had changed entirely. He wasn't coming over to check on his mother anymore. He was coming over to inventory an asset. He started mentioning my memory, asking if I'd left the stove on, or pointing out that I'd misplaced my keys. Keys I knew for an absolute fact I had left on the entryway table. He was building a case against my own mind, and I already realized exactly who he was building it for. Patience is something you learn when you've raised 3 children and buried a husband. David assumed because my steps were slower, my mind was slipping too. He thought I was just sitting in my rocking chair watching the days drift by. He didn't know about the quiet Thursday afternoons I spent downtown while he thought I was safely at my gardening club. A week later, he arrived at my house with a man in a sharp gray suit. He introduced him as a friendly inspector, just checking the foundation to make sure I was safe in such a big, drafty place. I poured them lemonade. I sat in my favorite armchair while David walked this total stranger through my hallways, pointing out the original hardwood and the updated kitchen fixtures. I heard him whisper that they needed to move fast before my condition deteriorated further. When they finally finished their tour, David placed a stack of papers on my dining table. He used his softest, most patronizing voice. He said it was just standard medical proxy forms, just in case of an emergency. And he handed me his favorite silver pen. I didn't take the pen. I let it sit there on the polished oak. Instead, I reached into my purse and placed a thick, blue-bound folder right on top of his carefully arranged papers. It was a legally binding, irrevocable trust drawn up by a senior partner at a firm I had retained 3 weeks ago. I watched David's eyes scan the gold lettering on the cover. I told him quietly that I had officially revoked his power of attorney. I kept my voice perfectly level as I explained that the house, the savings accounts, and everything his father built were now locked in a trust managed by a neutral third-party fiduciary. I watched his face drain of color as I added the final detail. He had been entirely removed as a beneficiary. The silence in the room was heavier than lead. He tried to stammer out an excuse, his hands shaking, as he claimed he was just trying to protect me, that I was confused. I pulled the folded Whispering Pines brochure from my cardigan pocket and laid it next to the trust document. I told him he didn't need to worry about protecting me anymore, and that he was no longer welcome in the home he had already tried to sell. The appraiser awkwardly excused himself, walking quickly out the front door. My son, the man who thought he could erase my life for a quick payout, just stood there speechless. He packed his briefcase in silence and walked out the door with absolutely nothing. They mistake our quietness for weakness, not realizing that you don't survive a lifetime by being loud, you survive by being ready.